The night of July 24, 1943, along the German coast, in the chain of radar bunkers that guard the approaches to Hamburg, the evening begins like any other. Inside each Würzburg station, an operator watches a small circular screen for a single point of light. That point of light is a Royal Air Force bomber. The job is simple, and these men are good at it. They keep the bomber centered. They read its range and its bearing. They pass the numbers to a controller, who passes them to a night fighter waiting somewhere above in the dark. One bomber, one fighter, one kill. That is the system, and it has worked for the better part of 3 years. Then the screens break. They do not flicker. They do not fail. They do something far stranger. Up and down the coast, at almost the same instant, the single point of light splits, and splits again. Within seconds, the screens are so crowded with returns that the real bomber is lost somewhere inside the crowd. Hundreds of contacts, then thousands. They bloom across the displays faster than anyone can count. A snowstorm of false aircraft, where a moment ago there had been one real one. The operators call out ranges that mean nothing. By every rule they were taught, this cannot happen. Aircraft do not multiply. The sky does not fill with 10,000 bombers in the space of a breath. It is happening everywhere at once. In the night fighters overhead, the small airborne radar sets show the same blizzard. The searchlights below begin to wander across the clouds with no target to fix on. The flak batteries open up, but they are firing blind, throwing shells into empty air. And from the bunkers to the cockpits, the men keep asking the one question the entire German air defense had no answer for that night. What are we looking at? The answer was paper. Thin strips of paper backed with aluminium foil, cut to a precise length, thrown out of bomber windows by hand, a few bundles every minute, drifting down through the dark over the North Sea. That is all it was, and it was about to break the most sophisticated air defense network on Earth in a single stroke. This is the story of how the British took a strip of metal foil that cost almost nothing and used it to blind a system that had taken Germany years and a fortune to build. A weapon so simple and so devastating that both sides invented it, and both sides were so terrified of it that they hid it from their own forces for over a year. It is also the story of a secret that won a battle precisely because, for too long, nobody dared to use it. To understand the night the screens went white over Hamburg, we have to go back to the quiet problem that a handful of British scientists had been turning over since long before that night. We have to start with the physics of a falling piece of metal. The idea was almost embarrassingly old. As early as 1937, a British researcher named Gerald Touch had suggested that suspended wires might overwhelm a radar set. Around the same time, the scientific intelligence officer Reginald Victor Jones had floated the notion that falling metal foil could do the same thing. The principle underneath it is elegant. A radar works by sending out a radio pulse and listening for the echo that bounces back off an aircraft. If you cut a strip of metal to roughly half the wavelength of that radar pulse, the strip resonates. It catches the energy and throws it back, loud and bright, as if it were a solid aircraft. A few hundred of those strips drifting together return an echo the size of a heavy bomber. A few thousand bundles return a fleet that does not exist. The person who turned that idea into a working weapon was a physicist named Joan Curran. She was Welsh. She was the only woman scientist at the Telecommunications research establishment, and in early 1942, she ran the first real experiments herself. The account left by her husband is wonderfully plain. She cut up a large amount of metal foil with her household scissors. Then she arranged for the strips to be dropped from an aircraft sent up from an aerodrome on the south coast. The effect on the radar screens was, in his word, amazing. It looked as though a large fleet of aircraft had appeared out of nowhere. She tried wires. She tried larger sheets. She settled on strips. The head of the establishment gave the device a deliberately meaningless code name so that it would reveal nothing. He called it Window, and then Britain refused to use it. For more than a year, Window sat ready and forbidden. The reason was fear, and it was not a foolish fear. The argument, pressed hardest by Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, ran like this. The moment a British bomber scattered these strips over Germany, German scientists would gather them up, measure them, understand them in an afternoon, and copy them. And then the Germans would use the same trick against British radar, at a time when the defense of British cities still depended on those screens. Fighter Command opposed release. Anti-Aircraft Command opposed release. The Ministry of Home Security opposed release. The men of Bomber Command, who were watching their crews die at a steady, grinding rate over Germany, demanded it again and again, and were refused. Here is the part that turns the whole story into something close to tragedy. While the British argued about whether to use window, the Germans had already invented it. Their own researchers had discovered the identical effect and given it the codename Doppel, after the district near Berlin where the early tests took place. The results were taken to Hermann Göring, and Göring, faced with exactly the same fear that paralyzed the British, made exactly the same choice, only harder. He reportedly ordered the research reports destroyed and clamped the strictest secrecy over the whole subject. The penalty for talking about it was so frightening that German scientists stopped working on it altogether. Nobody dared even study how to defend against a weapon they were forbidden to mention. So both sides held the same loaded gun, and both sides were too afraid to fire it, and the difference in the end came down to who flinched first. By the summer of 1943, the balance had tipped for Britain. The German bomber force was committed in the east. Few raids fell on British cities anymore, and captured German radar equipment, seized in a daring commando raid on the French coast the year before, had shown British intelligence that German sets worked on only a narrow band of frequencies, which made them very easy to jam. At a meeting in mid-July, with Winston Churchill present, the head of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, was finally given permission to use window on an operation of his own choosing. He chose Hamburg. The operation had a biblical code name for a city about to be destroyed by fire. It was called Gomorrah, and so, on that same July night, 791 aircraft took off for Hamburg. The crews had been briefed on the strange new cargo, and one squadron had been trained to push the bundles down the flare chute by stopwatch, one bundle a minute. As they crossed toward the coast, the airmen began throwing window into the slipstream by hand. That first night, the bomber force released around 92 million strips, something close to 40 tons of paper and foil, fluttering down across the approaches to the city. The effect was everything Joan Curran's first experiment had promised, multiplied by a war. The German radar network simply stopped working. The ground stations that tracked the bombers were swamped. The night fighters, groping through the dark with their own small radar sets, were swamped too. The general who had built the whole defensive system, Josef Kammhuber, summed up what had happened to it in a single flat sentence. The whole defense was blinded in one stroke, and the proof was in the arithmetic of survival. Of those 791 aircraft, only 12 were lost that night. That is barely 1.5%. On earlier raids against Hamburg, Bomber Command had been losing something closer to 6% of the force every time. Crews who never came home, bombers that fell out of the sky because a man in a bunker had read a point of light correctly. Window did not make the bombers faster or tougher, it made them invisible. It took the eyes of the entire system and filled them with snow. What followed over Hamburg in the days after was a horror that belongs to a darker chapter than this one. On the night of July 27, a second great raid, helped by freakishly hot and dry weather and a concentration of incendiary bombs, set off the first man-made firestorm of the war. The fire generated its own wind, drawing in air at hurricane speed, reaching temperatures that have been estimated at around 800 degrees Celsius. Tens of thousands of people died in Hamburg across the campaign. The most widely accepted figure is around 37,000. It is worth being precise about what Window did and did not do here. Window did not start the firestorm. Window kept the bombers alive long enough to reach the city. The fire was made by bombs and weather and the cruel physics of a burning city, not by strips of foil. But the strips of foil had done something the Germans could not undo by morning. They had proven that the great defensive line was brittle. That line, the chain of ground stations stretching across occupied Europe, had one fatal weakness hidden inside all its sophistication. Each control zone could handle only one interception at a time. One bomber, one fighter, one operator reading one point of light. British planners had already learned to pour their bombers through in a single concentrated stream, far more aircraft than the system could ever process. Window was the final blow. It blinded each zone at the exact moment hundreds of bombers were pouring through it. The Germans were not stupid, and they did not stay helpless for long. The recovery was fast and clever. A colonel named Hajo Hermann argued that if radar could not find the bombers, pilots should hunt them by eye over the burning target, lit up by the fires and the searchlights below. These freelance fighters were called wild boar. Other crews were turned loose to follow the bomber stream from early on, guided by a running radio commentary rather than by a single rigid zone. They were called tame boar, and German engineers rushed a new airborne radar into service, one that worked on a longer wavelength that the early window strips were not cut to jam. The radar war became a ladder. Every British rung was answered by a German rung, longer strips, new jammers, new tactics, all the way to the end of the war. Yet the men at the top of the Reich understood what Hamburg had revealed about them. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, warned Hitler that a few more such blows against German cities could bring the war to a rapid end. Adolf Galland, the general commanding the fighter arm, wrote that, after Hamburg, a single sentence began to circulate among the German command: "The war is lost." The night fighter pilot Wilhelm Schonen, who flew against these raids, later described the chaos from the cockpit, vectored into empty sky, chasing contacts that were not there, an entire night of skilled men reduced to guessing. These are not the words of a beaten enemy making excuses. They were spoken and written by the people who had built the thing that broke. So here is the answer to the question those radar operators were shouting into their handsets on the night the screens turned white. What were they looking at? They were looking at the cheapest war-winning idea of the entire conflict. Not a faster bomber, not a heavier bomb, a strip of paper backed with foil, cut to the right length by a woman with a pair of household scissors, an idea so obvious that two great powers discovered it independently, and so frightening that both of them hid it from their own soldiers. The Germans lost the race not because they failed to think of it, but because they were the first to bury it and the last to use it. Britain won that particular night by deciding, at long last, to be brave with a simple thing. The people in this story were real, and most of them are not famous. Joan Curran went on to work on other secret programs and lived until 1999. Reginald Victor Jones, who had imagined falling foil years before, spent his life insisting that the war was won as much by clever ideas as by brave men. The airmen who threw those bundles out into the freezing slipstream, 1 a minute, by stopwatch, mostly went home afterward and said very little about it. And on the other side, the operators in those bunkers, who had done everything right and watched their screens betray them anyway, learned in a single night that the most advanced machine in the world is only as strong as the assumption hidden inside it. The assumption was that an echo meant an aircraft. A few tons of paper proved it wrong. If a story like this one is worth keeping alive, the small things help more than you would think. A like, a comment, a subscribe. They keep these histories in front of the people who care about getting them right. Tell me in the comments if someone in your family flew with Bomber Command, or worked the radar, or remembers those years at all. Those memories are the real record, and they deserve to be kept.